Hello friends. Today we extend our analysis of economic growth and international trade to a large country case. That is, we are going to explore what will be the effect of output as well as on terms of trade with respect to a large country when it experiences economic growth. And we are going to explore what is known as the immiserising growth, where the economic growth at times can harm developing countries. Welcome to the session. The theory of immiserising growth was popularized by Jagdish N Bhagawati in his work in the year 1958 titled Immiserising Growth, a Geometrical Note, published in the Review of Economic Studies in June 1958. Before explaining the real implication of immiserising growth, first of all, let us explore what can have the possible effect of economic growth on a large country case. So we have at least two effects of economic growth on a large country, which is known as one, the output effect, and the other, the terms of trade effect. The output effect refers to the increase in output as a result of economic growth, that is output per worker or output per labor, output per person increases as a result of economic growth, which is the first effect. The second effect is the terms of trade effect. Says that when a country experiences economic growth, obviously it will have an influence on the terms of trade of the country. That is, if the volume of trade increases at the constant relative prices, then the terms of trade may deteriorate for a large country. On the other hand, if volume of trade in fact declines at constant relative prices, at constant international prices, then even terms of trade can improve for the country. So these are the two effects. So we have two effects of economic growth on international trade. One is the output effect and the second one is the terms of trade effect. Now let us explain the implication of immiserising growth. Bhagawati points out that when a country experiences economic growth, either as a result of factor growth or as a result of technological progress. We have already seen in our case of economic growth on international trade that there are two sources of economic growth. One, as a result of factor growth, increase in the endowment of the factors of production, or second, as a result of the technological progress. So we have two sources of economic growth, factor growth as well as technological progress. Now let us assume that as a result of economic growth, then either as a result of technological progress or as a result of factor growth, the terms of trade of the country deteriorates. So much so that it offset the entire benefit of growth itself. That is, when a country experiences economic growth, as a result of economic growth, it causes such a severe deterioration, such a sharp decline, such a severe deterioration in the country's terms of trade, so that the benefit of economic growth itself is offset by the deterioration of the terms of trade, so that the country will wind up with a lower level of economic welfare as a result of economic growth. Note the point. That is, as a result of economic growth, not only that the welfare is not increasing, the country is worse off than before, because the evil effect or the bad effect, the negative effect of the deterioration of the terms of trade is greater than the positive effect of what is known as the output effect or the wealth effect. So the deterioration of the terms of trade is larger than the benefit of the wealth effect itself. So this is the essence of the immiserising growth, and as a result of economic growth, the country pushes towards a lower level of welfare. The country is worse off than before. In fact, the misery increases. Growth leads to increasing misery, and that's the logic of immiserising growth. So as a result of economic growth, as a result of the deterioration of the terms of trade, the country ends up with a lower level of welfare. That means economic growth and international trade harm countries, especially when the terms of trade deteriorates. Now let us explore this possibility of immiserising growth. We will of course analyze what are the reasons behind the immiserising growth. Now let us say at least we can identify how the immiserising growth take place by using a diagram. See, we have a situation of country 1 where we know that this country 1 in fact specializes in the production of commodity X, and this country experiences an economic growth. So the initial production process or the initial production point of this country is the point B. Point B in the terms of trade line TT, and this country produces at point B and consumes at point E. In fact, consumes at point Z. So we have the production point B and the consumption point Z, and the welfare obviously of the consumption point Z is represented by the indifference curve IC2. So this is the initial situation of country 1. That is, before economic growth, the country produces at point B and consumes at point Z at indifference curve IC2. Now, let us explore the possibility of economic growth. Let us see that this country in fact experiences an economic growth, and let us also assume that this economic growth is biased in favor of commodity X, which is the country's exportable commodity. As a result of economic growth, there is an outward shift in the production possibility curve. So initially the production possibility curve is AA. Now the new production possibility curve is A1, and it is asymmetrical towards country's exportable commodity. That is, the economic growth is highly biased in favor of country's exportable commodity. So there is an asymmetrical shift. Now, when there is an increase in output of commodity X, what happens is that there is a change in the terms of trade. In fact, the initial terms of trade line was that of TT, and the new terms of trade line is T1, and the new production point is point M, and the new consumption point is point E, and point E in fact lies at a lower indifference curve, implying that the country winds up with a lower level of welfare, because the initial consumption point was that of Z, and now as a result of economic growth, now the new consumption point is point E, and at point E the welfare of the representative citizen might have declined because you are on a lower indifference curve. So this is what happens when a country experiences economic growth, and as a result of economic growth the terms of trade declines. Now let us explain what are the reasons behind the immiserising growth. Bhagawati points out that there can be at least two reasons. One, as a result of economic growth, the output of country's exportable commodity increases. The first one, that is, economic growth leads to a massive increase in the output of country's exportable commodity. The first reason behind the economic growth. The first reason behind the immiserising growth. And the second reason is that the export sector of the country suffers from very low elasticity. So we have two reasons. One, the output of, as a result of economic growth, the output of country's exportable commodity increases. The second reason is that the export sector of the country, the export commodities of the country suffers from very low demand elasticities internationally. So these two reason obviously means that when a country experiences economic growth, obviously the output of these commodities will increase, and when the output of this commodity will increase, since these commodities have very low elasticity, the terms of trade will turn against the exporting country, or in fact the terms of trade will deteriorate. That means these two act and react upon each other, that when output increases, since the elasticity is low, obviously that means that the terms of trade will turn against the exporting country, or in fact will deteriorate for the country. And should also be noted that the immiserising growth is true only for those countries who are large enough to affect the international prices. That means we have seen that when there is a growth in the exportable commodity, the terms of trade declines. It is guaranteed, it is ensured only when the country is large enough to affect the international prices. So this country should be, immiserising growth will take place only when the country is strong enough, is large enough to affect the international prices. And secondly, the welfare of the country should be closely associated with the export. That means the welfare of the citizens of this country should be closely related to the export sector. That's why when the terms of trade it declines, the welfare in fact declines, or in fact welfare in fact comes down. So that's the essence. That means the country should be so heavily dependent on the country's export sector, so that a decline in the terms of trade adversely affect the welfare of the country. So the immiserising growth is likely to take place for the case of those countries who are exporting primary commodities. We know that in our earlier discussion, the primary commodity suffers from very low elasticities. So if at all immiserising growth is taking place, it will be taking place in the case of those countries who are exporting primary commodities, because primary commodities do have very low elasticity. That's when output of the primary commodities increases, since it fetches low elasticity of demand, when the output of primary commodities increases, the demand or the world demand will not increase. So much so that there will not be any changes in the demand. In fact, the elasticity of demand is very low, and obviously it will lead to a sharp reduction in the terms of trade, or in fact deterioration for the terms of trade of those countries who are specializing in the export of primary commodities. So even though many economists in fact criticize the immiserising growth, it in fact points out a situation in which those countries who are specializing in the production of primary commodities can in fact be worse off than before. That is, as a result of economic growth, the country winds up with a lower level of welfare. And not only that, the country is not at all gaining anything from the economic growth, it winds up with a lower level of welfare and it is worse off than before. So the Bhagawati's analysis, or the theory of immiserising growth, points towards the drawbacks of export biased growth, the pro-trade growth, the export-led growth. Because if the country is so dependent on your export sector and your commodity suffers from low elasticity, then economic growth and international trade can harm your country. In fact, it can lead to the immiserising growth. It can increase your misery. Forget about increasing the welfare. So that's the essence of immiserising growth, and it points out towards a situation in which economic growth as well as international trade can at times harm developing countries, when the terms of trade of the country can deteriorate, or in fact may deteriorate, and countries will wind up with a lower level of welfare. So that's all as far as immiserising growth is concerned. So until we meet next time, stay safe, happy learning. Thank you.